After recently finishing Deathloop, my first urge was to jump straight into Arkane's disturbingly disordered universe of Dishonored, namely playing the best in the series, which is, in my opinion, Dishonored 2. I wanted to play through again as the infamous Corvo, with my intentions being primarily to size up the game against Deathloop, put them toe to toe, highlight their differences, see how they compare, and ultimately give my opinion on which would win in this epic head-to-head duel. My secondary intention was to go completely against my regular gaming instincts, which are usually to play through stealthily, and after sneakily slipping and sliding my way through Dunwall in our review of the first Dishonored,
what do you get when you mess with Corvo? Kicked in the balls and dragged round Dunwall, eaten by rats in a dirty place, for blinking you'll get stabbed, bitch. Bitch.
It was time to leave Dunwall behind and play a little closer to the spirit of Deathloop by slicing and dicing my way through Karnaca.
Having a mooch around Karnaca, blood flies chewing on your tallywhacker. Got no chance if you ain't got manner, come and stroke me bone charm. Bitch.
Both Deathloop and all of the Dishonored games are amazing, and on the face of things there's some really obvious similarities, with both being built on Arkane's Void engine, obviously, that's to be expected. But having played both back to back, underneath their wonderful skins there are some fairly big differences that I believe to be the reason we saw such varying review scores recently for Deathloop. So I'm going to break this down into sections and give each game a win or a loss in that section, count them up and see who wins. Why? Because why the fuck not? How dare I compare them and share my vastly superior opinion with what I'm hoping to be at least 64 people.
Oh, I'm such a shit!
Let's start with the story. Deathloop is a tough concept to add much depth or premise to. It's a constant mystery throughout as to why the main protagonist, Colt, is continuously waking up on Black Reef Island. The island that's clearly dedicated to science. Set in the 60s, it's a game of cat and mouse between Colt and Juliana, as well as 7 other figurehead scientists called the Visionaries, who Colt must eliminate within a single day to break the loop. All the questions are answered, as you'd expect, in the final moments of the game. The story was never intended to be the X factor in Deathloop, and it's very self-aware of that, strongly leaning on a comedic angle with some hilarious writing, giving Colt and Juliana in particular some fantastic back and forth one-liners. The story very much hinged on the ending, of which there are 3 alternative ones, but none of them really blew me away, and the backstory, the lore, and the overall immersion and commitment I felt in the world was very dependent on the dot-to-dot nature of whacking each visionary in a certain order. In Dishonored 2, the Empire of the Isles seemed to really have it in for Corvo, really showing their intent to make him a murderer, because just like the original, he's being framed for murder. For the second time! The premise, the backstory and the foundation to Dunwall in the original, before the tale heads over to Karnaca, the events have already taken place such as the plague and the unbalanced society, conveying such a large chasm between the Empire of the Isles' authoritative, elitist, royalty type figures and the low level gangs that scrounge the streets, fighting amongst themselves whilst trying to avoid the plague. When it comes to story, I've got to hand Dishonored the win on this one. Just like in Dishonored 2, there are multiple endings in Deathloop, and the endings are only decided by your absolute final choice in the game. All your previous actions in the game mean nothing towards the ending, whereas Dishonored's endings are dictated through a constant measurement of your playstyle. Are you non-lethally clean and honourable, or are you a bloodthirsty killing machine? This, as well as some key decisive moments, control the story's outcome, which adds such a deeper, ongoing requirement for your commitment to playing the Corvo or Emily you want to be. Deathloop's alternative endings feel bottlenecked somehow, losing the perception of choices. Yes, there are literally choices to be made at the end, but the differences between them aren't exactly drastic, and I think this comes down to the structure of the story that led before our final meeting with Juliana. Dishonored for the win on this one. Now, the characters in Dishonored are a little bleak, with not much depth in their design beyond good versus evil. They're far from being poorly conceived either, and are clearly propping up the story behind Dishonored, which Arkane wanted to be taken seriously. It's purposefully dreary, bleak, and deprived of anything that would even come close to being considered uplifting. Corvo suits his dry, sinister approach to life, but the other characters too have a similarly one-dimensional personality, with probably the only exception being Jintosh, the wacky, borderline insane inventor of the Clockwork Soldiers. In Deathloop, Colt and Juliana's constant back and forth repertoire is performed pretty much impeccably throughout, with so much life given to each character's vocal performances. Their vulgarities are right up my street in all honesty, and they both played out some of the funniest exchanges I've ever heard in a game before. The other 7 Visionaries too each have massively diverse personalities, from Charlie and Fear being a couple of love-locked dopey lovebirds, Wenji's insecurities and dedication to science, and the eccentric nature of the party host Alexis. So, I've got to give Deathloop the win for characters.
Son of a fuck!
It feels like Arkane had set out with a goal to be much more bombastically explosive in their approach for Deathloop, but maybe, either instinctively or intentionally, had some internal disagreements about this approach. They negated the stealth necessity and lent heavily on a more wham bam thank you ma'am stylistic outlook. Stealth is there, but with nothing more than the basic detection meters and crouching behind an enemy to snap their necks in what is pretty brutal fashion. There's no need to cover your tracks because the loop does that for you, and there's no option to play non-lethally. There wasn't much else from a stealth point of view in the game, so really I wished Arkane doubled down on the action instead, because the snappy, fast-paced action is where the game truly shines, with some crunching gun sounds and incredibly gratifying and innovative ways to use a combination of serious firepower blended with some familiar Arkane-style abilities that rest at the tip of Colt's fingers to really toy with those enemy Eternalists. The kick though, it's a joke. A hilarious one too. It's fun to see an enemy catapulted off a cliff edge with a swift kick to the bollocks, but once I realised how overpowered this kick was, it almost felt like cheating, and I ended up using it only when I was either in a tight corner or in desperate need of a chuckle. In Dishonored 1 and 2, stealth is the primary focus, with shadows playing a part, blowing out candles, picking up bodies, hiding them in a dumpster, or finding a swarm of rats to devour them into fleshy, bitty dust, distracting enemies, freezing time to slip in and out of rooms, and the option to play non-lethally. Albeit stealth feels more of the focus here, I'd argue we've got even more creativity at our fingertips compared to Deathloop. It isn't just one or the other in Dishonored. We can rip the guards of the Empire of the Isles limb from limb in such horrifically impressive and creative ways. It's almost an art form. Dishonored has a wide range of enemies: humans, nest keepers, witches, swarms of rats, bloodflies, dogs, and the infamous Clockwork Soldiers, each needing to be taken down in vastly differing ways. Dishonored has more powers, more weapons, more tools to obliterate your enemies with, and the simple fact we get a little graph that's split into non-lethal, lethal, assault, and stealth at the end of each level shows the variations in style and giving the player so much freedom to play how they want. Now I know Deathloop has the online aspect as well, where players can invade Colt's world for some classic PvP, but the fact it takes so long to even join a server, and once connected the one-on-one nature is nothing revolutionary and can be found in so many other games, it takes another big step even further away from Arkane's roots, so this was never going to sway the win for Deathloop in the combat section unfortunately, so Dishonored wins this one hands down. Now normally it wouldn't be fair to compare the visuals of a 2016 game against a 2021 game, but they're surprisingly close. I played both at 4K on a 3090, so I'm doing my best to maximise their potential, and toe to toe, there's very little in it. A lot will come down to personal preference, with the game's settings obviously being very different from each other, having a very different aesthetic, but my preference is to pick the gloomy, dismal streets of Dunwall and Karnaca. Some might prefer the colourful, vibrant pop of Deathloop's funky 60s setting, and I really enjoyed that too to be honest, especially considering we got to venture through grey steel and concrete structures as well, which added a nice contrast to the setting throughout Deathloop. Dishonored still had some variety too, comparing the upper-class Edwardian architecture, opulently decorated with the finest furniture, lavish ornaments and glistening cutlery, that totally clashes with the bottom-feeding gangs that converge upon the dingy, plague-ridden back alleys of Dunwall and Karnaca. Technically, Deathloop just has the edge over Dishonored 2, but there's a 5-year gap, don't forget. It still looks good and has that slight cell shade effect which seems to be Arkane's calling card, and it works again, but the textures and the aliasing haven't exactly come on leaps and bounds since 2016. Shadows have certainly been improved in Deathloop though, as well as the draw distance at the cost of some frames, which is to be expected. Both got off to bad starts on PC too, with the Void engine seeming to struggle, stuttering harshly when using a keyboard and mouse. I've still got to give Dishonored the win on this one though, after combining my personal preference for the locations and that after a nearly 5-year gap between the two games, there's not been a huge step up in visual fidelity either, which can be taken either as a compliment to Dishonored 2 or a major diss to Deathloop. Both Dishonored 2 and Deathloop have the option to play as two characters, albeit Deathloop's alternative character Juliana is restricted to online play, though she still has some development and progression associated with her. This doesn't change the story itself though. The skills and the power differences between Corvo and Emily in Dishonored 2, by comparison, are huge, adding so much replay value, and that's not even considering the option to play aggressively as one character and stealthily as another. Deathloop had a real stop-start nature to it, forcing me to crawl through the menus prior to entering the loop, and this has been hidden really well in Dishonored, thanks to the Dreadful Whale, the boat that acts as a player hub between each mission. There's lore and secrets to be found, and visible differences will appear, namely certain characters thanks to the choices we make throughout the game. The black markets really add another level of immersion, keeping either Corvo or Emily topped up on tools and ammunition, as well as upgrading weapons with blueprints we find dotted around the maps. This is one thing, but upgrading my powers with runes and adding traits with bone charms kept me invested in the world because it can all be done on the fly. As simple as that sounds, it's done from the menu which is accessed as we play. Whereas in Deathloop, leaving the loop to upgrade might seem like a tiny gripe, but it really broke up the immersion for me. Not only that though, the trinkets and power upgrades are extremely basic in Deathloop. They're fun to use and have a noticeable difference on the gameplay when applied, but I had duplicates coming out of my eyeballs. I felt pretty limited with 3 slots and virtually no expansion on these traits other than each trait's colour code representing a slightly more powerful version of that same trait. Whereas in Dishonored, there's not only a ton of upgradable skill trees to invest in and bone charm traits to add, we can even craft our own bone charms and runes by sacrificing previous ones. By combining them, the thrill of the gamble kicks in. We combine 4 simple traits into one super bone charm that only takes up 1 slot instead of 4. But will it become corrupted and contain a negative trait? Are the combination of traits still worth it regardless? Or have you just wasted 4 bone charms? It never felt like I was juggling my powers in Dishonored, whereas in Deathloop, I felt quite restricted. If Arkane were concerned about being overpowered, then add a difficulty setting, or add a balanced difficulty curve to the game itself. Either way, let me have my powers! Dishonored wins. Dishonored wins. Again, both games feel so similar, but after playing them back to back, there was a noticeable difference in how many varying and versatile ways we could break into a building, slip past a guard or unlock a door when comparing the two. The sheer number of levels for a start is an obvious one, with only 4 levels to explore in Deathloop. One could argue the differences between each level during morning, noon, afternoon and evening actually means there's 16 levels in Deathloop, but come on, it's still the same canvas. One window that's blocked in the morning being open in the afternoon detracts from the level design in my opinion. It's a really interesting concept though, and one I enjoyed exploring and understanding, but once I'd learned that morning equals this and evening equals that, meant exiting and entering the loop felt like another restriction. Everything in that level being available to me from the get-go in Dishonored is a simple formula, but one that just works. When exploring and hunting for clues, both have obvious waypoint markers, but it's the side missions that make Dishonored stand out once again. Searching for safe codes requires a keen eye to not only find them in notes, but written on boards, or have each digit hidden in different areas of the room. Deathloop often made this all too easy at times, with key information in some written notes being highlighted in orange, just in case you can't be bothered to read the rest. Some might prefer this easier approach, but I found the hunt for codes and the other tidbits of information far more rewarding in Dishonored. I'm not even sure myself what I mean by this, but I suppose I'm really talking about the systems at play, rare and quirky features that we've never really seen in other games. Something in Dishonored 2 that should have played a much bigger role in my opinion is the timepiece we receive at the Stilton Manor. It's a tool with a foldable lens which once unfolded gives us a little preview into the past, and using its full power can warp us completely into the past. It's brilliantly used for puzzle solving, traversal and even combat in some situations, and the fact that it's only available to use in one level is a bit of a letdown. This tool alone is a good enough idea to be used on a much wider scale. Deathloop's overall concept is another brilliant one, intricately connecting the dots between each visionary until eventually solving the puzzle as to how to eliminate all 7 of them in a single day was such a cleverly designed concept that, albeit simple for us gamers to see once we've cracked it, it must have taken an age for Arkane to connect all these characters to one another and leaving no flaws or loopholes in the plot, while still managing to maintain my interest and commitment at least to returning to a previously visited area. Then seeing each area take different shapes depending on the time of day was brilliantly executed. So for this section, when it comes to interesting concepts and originality, I think it's only fair to hand this section to Prey Mooncrash DLC.
Now that's bullshit.
Basically the exact same thing as that, but instead of killing 7 visionaries, you have to save 5 astronauts in one single loop. Pretty much the same thing really. So at the end of the video, it looks like the score is 7 to Dishonored, 1 to Prey Mooncrash, and 1 to Deathloop.
Son of a fuck!
I know it seems like I've come down a little hard on Deathloop, but to me, it's night and day between the two. Deathloop is still a very solid game, but I'd love to hear everyone else's opinions on the two. Did you prefer Deathloop? What about Prey? I've not had a chance to play Prey recently, but I'm almost certain that Prey would win in this battle too. What do you guys think? Let us know, and hopefully we'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.